The October Game by Ray Bradbury. He put the gun back into the bureau drawer and shut the drawer. No, not that way. Louise wouldn't suffer. It was very important that this thing have, above all, duration. Duration through imagination. How to prolong the suffering. How, first of all, to bring it about. Well, the man standing before the bedroom mirror carefully fitted his cufflinks together. He paused long enough to hear the children run by swiftly on the street below. Outside this warm two-story house, like so many gray mice, the children, like so many leaves. By the sound of the children, you knew the calendar day. By their screams, you knew what evening it was. You knew it was very late in the year, October, the last day of October, with white bone masks and cut pumpkins and the smell of dropped candle wax. No, things hadn't been right for some time. October didn't help any. If anything, it made things worse. He adjusted his black bow tie. If this was spring, he nodded slowly, quietly, emotionlessly at his image in the mirror, then there might be a chance. But tonight, all the world was burning down into ruin. There was no green spring, none of the freshness, none of the promise. There was a soft running in the hall. That's Marion, he told himself, my little one. All 8 quiet years of her, never a word, just her luminous gray eyes and her wondering little mouth. His daughter had been in and out all evening, trying on various masks, asking him which was the most terrifying, most horrible. They had both finally decided on the skeleton mask. It was just awful. It would scare the beans from people. Again, he caught the long look of thought and deliberation he gave himself in the mirror. He had never liked October. Ever since he first lay in the autumn leaves before his grandmother's house many years ago and heard the wind and sway of the empty trees, it had made him cry without a reason, and a little of that sadness returned each year to him. It always went away with the spring, but it was different tonight. There was a feeling of autumn coming to last 1,000,000 years. There would be no spring. He had been crying quietly all evening. It didn't show. Not a vestige of it on his face. It was all hidden somewhere, and it wouldn't stop. The rich, syrupy smell of sweets filled the bustling house. Louise had laid out apples and new skins of toffee. There were vast bowls of punch, fresh mixed, stringed apples at each door scooped, vented pumpkins peering triangularly from each cold window. There was a water tub in the center of the living room, waiting, with a sack of apples nearby for dunking to begin. All that was needed was the catalyst, the impouring of children to start the apples bobbing, the stringed apples to penduluming in the crowded doors, the sweets to vanish, the halls to echo with fright or delight. It was all the same. Now the house was silent with preparation, and just a little more than that. Louise had managed to be in every other room save the room he was in today. It was her very fine way of intimating, "Oh, look, Mitch, see how busy I am. So busy that when you walk into a room I'm in, there's always something I need to do in another room. Just see how I dash about." For a while he had played a little game with her, a nasty childish game. When she was in the kitchen, then he came to the kitchen saying, "I need a glass of water." After a moment, he standing drinking water, she like a crystal witch over the caramel brew, bubbling like a prehistoric mud pot on the stove. She said, "Oh, I must light the pumpkins." And she rushed to the living room to make the pumpkins smile with light. He came after, smiling, "I must get my pipe." "Oh, the cider," she had cried, running to the dining room. "I'll check the cider," he had said. But when he tried following, she ran to the bathroom and locked the door. He stood outside the bathroom door, laughing strangely and senselessly, his pipe gone cold in his mouth. And then, tired of the game but stubborn, He waited another 5 minutes. There was not a sound from the bath, unless she enjoyed in any way knowing that he waited outside. Irritated, he suddenly jerked about and walked upstairs, whistling merrily. At the top of the stairs, he had waited. Finally, he had heard the bathroom door unlatch, and she had come out, and life below stairs had resumed, as life in a jungle must resume once a terror has passed on away and the antelope returned to their spring. Now, as he finished his bow tie and put on his dark coat, there was a mouse rustle in the hall. Marion appeared in the door, all skeletons in her disguise. "How do I look, Papa?" "Fine." From under the mask, blonde hair showed. From the skull socket, small blue eyes smiled. He sighed. Marion and Louise, the two silent denouncers of his virility, his dark power. What alchemy had there been in Louise that took the dark of a dark man and bleached the dark brown eyes and black hair and washed and bleached the ingrown baby, all during the period before birth until the child was born? Marion, blonde, blue-eyed, ruddy-cheeked. Sometimes he suspected that Louise had conceived the child as an idea, completely asexual, an immaculate conception of contemptuous mind and cell. As a firm rebuke to him, she had produced the child in her own image, and to top it, she had somehow fixed the doctors, so he shook his head and said, "Sorry, Mr. Wilder, your wife will never have another child. This is the last one." "And I wanted a boy," Mitch had said 8 years ago. He almost bent to take hold of Marion now in her skull mask. He felt an inexplicable rush of pity for her because she had never had a father's love, only the crushing holding love of a loveless mother. But most of all, he pitied himself, that somehow he had not made the most of a bad birth, enjoyed his daughter for herself, regardless of her not being dark and a son and like himself. Somewhere he had missed out. Other things being equal, he would have loved a child, but Louise hadn't wanted a child anyway in the first place. She had been frightened of the idea of birth. He had forced the child on her, and from that night, all through the year until the agony of the birth itself, Louise had lived in another part of the house. She had expected to die with the first child. It had been very easy for Louise to hate this husband who so wanted a son that he gave his only wife over to the mortuary. But Louise had lived, and in triumph. Her eyes, the day he came to the hospital, were cold. "I'm alive," they said, "and I have a blonde daughter. Just look." And when he had put out a hand to touch, the mother had turned away to conspire with her new pink daughter child, away from that dark, forcing murderer. It had all been so beautifully ironic. His selfishness deserved it. But now, it was October again. There had been other Octobers, and when he thought of the long winter, he'd been filled with horror year after year to think of the endless months. Mortared into the house by an insane fall of snow, trapped with a woman and child, neither of whom loved him for months on end. During the 8 years there had been respites. In spring and summer you got out, walked, picnicked. These were desperate solutions to the desperate problem of a hated man. But in winter the hikes and picnics and escapes fell away with the leaves. Life, like a tree, stood empty, the fruit picked, the sap run to earth. Yes, you invited people in, but people were hard to get in winter with blizzards and all. Once he'd been clever enough to save for a Florida trip. They had gone south. He had walked in the open. But now, the 8th winter was coming. He knew things were finally at an end. He simply could not wear this one through. There was an acid walled off in him that slowly had eaten through tissue and bone over the years, and now, tonight, it would reach the wild explosive in him, and all would be over. There was a mad ringing at the bell below. In the hall, Louise went to see. Marion, without a word, ran off to greet the first arrivals. There were shouts and hilarity. He walked to the top of the stairs. Louise was below, taking cloaks. She was tall and slender and blonde to the point of whiteness, laughing down upon the new children. He hesitated. What was all this? The years? The boredom of living? Where had it gone wrong? Certainly not with the birth of the child alone, but it had been a symbol of all their tensions, he imagined, his jealousies and his business failures and all the rotten rest of it. Why didn't he just turn, pack a suitcase, and leave? No, not without hurting Louise as much as she had hurt him. It was simple as that. Divorce wouldn't hurt her at all. It would simply be an end to numb indecision. If he thought divorce would give her pleasure in any way, he would stay married for the rest of his life to her, for damned spite. No, he must hurt her. Figure some way, perhaps, to take Marion away from her, legally. Yes, that was it. That would hurt most of all, to take Marion. Hello down there, he descended the stairs, beaming. Louise didn't look up. Hi, Mr. Wilder, the children shouted, waved as he came down. By 10 o'clock, the doorbell had stopped ringing. The apples were bitten from stringed doors. The pink faces were wiped dry from the apple bobbling. Napkins were smeared with toffee and punch, and he, the husband with pleasant efficiency, had taken over. He took the party right out of Louise's hands. He ran about talking to the 20 children and the 12 parents who had come and were happy with the special spiked cider he had fixed them. He supervised pin the tail on the donkey, spin the bottle, musical chairs, and all the rest, amid fits of shouting laughter. Then, in the triangular-eyed pumpkin shine, all the house lights out, he cried, Hush, follow me, tiptoeing towards the cellar. The parents on the outer periphery of the costumed riot commented to each other, nodding at the clever husband, speaking to the lucky wife. How well he got on with children, they said. The children crowded after the husband, squealing. The cellar, he cried. The tomb of the witch. More squealing. He made a mock shiver. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here. The parents chuckled. One by one, the children slid down a slide which Mitch had fixed up from lengths of table section into the dark cellar. He hissed and shouted ghastly utterances after them. A wonderful wailing filled the dark, pumpkin-lighted house. Everybody talked at once, everybody but Marion. She had gone through all the party with a minimum of sound or talk. It was all inside her, all the excitement and joy. What a little troll, he thought. With a shut mouth and shiny eyes, she had watched her own party like so many serpentines thrown before her. Now, the parents. With laughing reluctance, they slid down the short incline uproarious, while little Marion stood by, always wanting to see it all, to be the last. Louise went down without help. He moved to aid her, but she was gone, even before he bent. The upper house was empty and silent in the candle shine. Marion stood by the slide. Here we go, he said, and picked her up. They sat in a vast circle in the cellar. Warmth came from the distant bulk of the furnace. The chairs stood in a long line along each wall, 20 squealing children, 12 rustling relatives, alternatively spaced, with Louise down at the far end, Mitch up at his end near the stairs. He peered, but saw nothing. They'd all grouped to their chairs, catch as you can in the blackness. The entire program from here on was to be enacted in the dark. He as Mr. Interlocutor. There was a child scampering, a smell of damp cement, and the sound of the wind out in the October stars. Now, cried the husband in the dark cellar. Quiet. Everybody settled. The room was black, not a light, not a shine, not a glint of an eye. A scraping of crockery, a metal rattle. The witch is dead, intoned the husband. Eee, said the children. The witch is dead. She has been killed, and here is the knife she was killed with. He handed over the knife. It was passed from hand to hand down and around the circle with chuckles and odd little cries and comments from the adults. "The witch is dead and this is her head," whispered the husband, and handed an item to the nearest person. "Oh, I know how this game is played," some child cried happily in the dark. "He gets some old chicken innards from the icebox and hands them round and says, 'These are her innards.' And he makes a clay head and passes it for her head and passes a soup bone for her arm. And then he takes a marble and says, 'This is her eye.' And he takes some corn and says, 'These are her teeth.' And he takes a sack of plum pudding and gives that and says, 'This is her stomach.' I know how this is played." "Hush, you'll spoil everything," some girls said. "The witch came to harm, and this is her arm," said Mitch. "Eee!" The items were passed and passed like hot potatoes round the circle. Some children screamed, wouldn't touch him. Some ran from their chairs to stand in the center of the cellar until the grisly items had passed. "Ah, it's only chicken inside," scoffed the boy. "Come back, Helen." Shot from hand to hand with small scream after scream, the items went down, down, to be followed by another and another. "The witch cut apart, and this is her heart," said the husband. 6 or 7 items moving at once through the laughing, trembling dark. Louise spoke up. "Marion, don't be afraid. It's only play." Marion didn't say anything. "Marion," asked Louise, "are you afraid?" Marion didn't speak. "She's all right," said the husband. "She's not afraid." On and on, the passing, the screams, the hilarity. The autumn wind sighed about the house, and he, the husband, stood at the head of the dark cellar, intoning the words, handing out the items. "Marion?" asked Louise again from far across the cellar. Everybody was talking. "Marion!" called Louise. Everybody quieted. "Marion, answer me! Are you afraid?" Marion didn't answer. The husband stood there at the bottom of the cellar steps. Louise called, "Marion, are you there?" No answer. The room was silent. "Where's Marion?" called Louise. "She was here," said a boy. "Maybe she's upstairs." "Marion!" No answer. It was quiet. Louise cried out, "Marion! Marion!" "Turn on the lights," said one of the adults. The items stopped passing. The children and adults sat with the witch's items in their hands. "No," Louise gasped. There was a scraping of her chair wildly in the dark. "No, don't turn on the lights. Oh, God, 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 don't turn them on, please. Don't turn on the lights, don't." Louise was shrieking now. The entire cellar froze with a scream. Nobody moved. Everyone sat in the dark cellar, suspended in the suddenly frozen task of this October game. The wind blew outside, banging the house. The smell of pumpkins and apples filled the room with the smell of the objects in their fingers, while one boy cried, "I'll go upstairs and look." And he ran upstairs hopefully and out around the house, 4 times round the house, calling out, "Marion! Marion! Marion!" over and over, and at last coming slowly down the stairs into the waiting, breathing cellar and saying into the darkness, "I can't find her." Then some idiot turned on the light. The Mummy's Curse. London is full of ghosts, but the best supernatural story in Bloomsbury concerns a mummy's curse. On the first floor of the British Museum are various rooms devoted to artifacts from ancient Egypt. There are several mummies and sarcophagi on display, but the one in question is numbered EA22542 and is in room 62. This mummy case was found in Thebes in Egypt and can be dated by its shape and the style of its decoration to the late 21st or early 22nd dynasty, about 950 to 900 BC. It's listed as a mummy case for an unknown singer to the god Amen-Ra. The case is covered in hieroglyphs and has a portrait of a very beautiful young girl. The mummy clearly had a long history before being found by Europeans, but the weirdness associated with it begins in the 1880s. It's said that a group of English tourists in Egypt bought the mummy case in Thebes from a local trader. This trader didn't say where he got it, but grave robbing was very common in those times to supply the demand from Westerners keen to have something of Egypt's history. The holy mumia was a powerful medicine, and those in search of healing would eat the dried mummy flesh. By the 16th century in Europe, mumia, or basically ground up mummy flesh, was considered one of the most efficacious of medicines. The European craze with ancient Egypt was at one of its heights in the 19th century, after Napoleon's campaign there in 1799. For the British population, the British takeover of Egypt in 1882, which lasted until after the Second World War, opened up the country to British citizens and tourists and fueled a fashion for all things Egyptian. Egyptomania had a further surge in the 1920s after Howard Carter's discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922. From the day these people in Thebes, however, purchased the mummy, accidents started to happen. The new owner was injured in a hunting accident the very next day. After that, one of the Englishmen in the party mysteriously vanished and was never seen again. The owner of the mummy case had to have his arm amputated after an accident, and believing that all this bad luck came from the mummy case, he sold it to a dealer in Cairo. We know that 3 people in succession bought it after that, and all of them died shortly after buying it, but not before they'd shipped the case from Egypt to London. This supposedly cursed artifact, also known as the unlucky mummy, is said to have caused many who came into contact with it to suffer from deep grief, disease, injury, and even death. People alleged that the mummy had a power which broke glass, and if you took a picture of it, it distorted the images in a disturbing way, and it produced unusual nighttime lights and frightening footsteps in the homes they stored it in. In London, a collector bought it, but a friend of the collector was psychic and felt great evil emanating from the coffin. He warned the man to get rid of it or it would kill him. The collector, being a wise man, took heed of this warning and sold it on. The new owner had it photographed professionally, but the photographer unexpectedly died the next day. Once the pictures that he'd taken were developed, instead of the beautiful girl in the case, they showed an ugly old woman, her eyes reputedly filled with evil. This owner sold it to a lady, and on the first night in the house, all of her pet animals died, and every piece of glass was smashed. She herself fell into a strange sleeping sickness that the doctor couldn't diagnose. When she gave the case away, or when it was given away for her, she just as suddenly got well again. According to one tradition, the ghost of the unlucky mummy enters 2 London Underground stations, or did do in the past, through hidden passageways, and it haunted these 2 London Underground stations. One of them was British Museum, which is now closed. It's said that one of these tube stops is where 2 ladies vanished, and some put that down to the power of the mummy. Some legends even claim that the mummy was aboard the Titanic and that it was her curse that caused the fabled ship to strike the iceberg and sink. Although there's some flaws in that if you think about it, because the mummy is back in the British Museum. According to the legend, the unlucky mummy is the dead body of a priestess of the sun deity, the powerful god Amun-Ra, and that she was a princess from ancient Egypt, and that all people who were responsible for removing her from her tomb and preventing her from resting in her last resting place are reputedly tracked by her and punished through the powerful magic and occult wisdom she gained as a priestess in the cult of Amun-Ra. Finally, the mummy case was donated to the British Museum. They moved it into the museum in 1889, and as the porters carried it in, one of them fell and broke his leg, and the other died a few days afterwards. The mummy case got a certain notoriety, and people came from far and wide. Many attempted to draw it, but nobody could sketch it accurately. The security men at the British Museum became so terrified that they wouldn't patrol the room at night. And they claimed that when they came to that particular room, something would detach itself from the darkness and that an invisible and horrible presence followed them. One of them said he actually saw it, and he described it as a thing with a wrinkled yellow-green face. A photographer allegedly killed himself after seeing the photographs of the mummy case developed. Altogether, the cursed mummy is supposed to have killed 13 people. The ghost story author J.A. Brooks recounts that in 1921, 2 young men took part in a secret exorcism of the case. During the exorcism, a spirit emerged, and they said that the spirit had the face of a jellyfish and that it leered at them out of the case. I wonder if this was the great Cthulhu, in fact, because he hangs around the British Museum as well. These young men said that the spirit with the jellyfish case was the guardian of the case and that there were powerful hieroglyphs on it, written on it, that caused the guardian to be evoked. And this was triggered by them attempting a magical ceremony, such as an exorcism is really, using supernatural power to drive off spirits. Luckily, despite the emergence of the jellyfish face, the exorcism seems to have worked, and they banished the evil spirit. And that might be true, because since that time I do not know of any other stories regarding the cursed mummy, though it's there. I've been to see it. When I was doing my research for this story, I came across an account by a guy called David Castleton, who's a blogger and an author, and he's got a blog called The Serpent's Pen, David Castleton. And he writes a lot of stories of this kind of thing. And he does a very, very well-researched, well-illustrated account. I got most of this stuff from J.A. Brooks's book, but David Castleton seems to have some other sources as well. So it really... and he actually talks about what happened in the British Museum after it arrived there, and there was a bit of a press fervor about it, and people became very interested in it, and people wanted to have seances. And even the guy called Ellis Budger, now Ellis Budger's got like a 3 or 4 volume series on, he's dead of course, on the Egyptian religion and magic, and I had copies of this. I never read it, it was too big. But he actually issued a statement that the mummy wasn't cursed. But of course, this was in the late 1880s, and we see that the exorcism was only completed by those people who snuck in the 20s, so in 1920s, that's to say. And so, perhaps it was still cursed then. Luckily, David has done a bit of research on the story about the Titanic. And as he says, one of the most fascinating claims about the unlucky mummy was that it was responsible for sinking the Titanic. So what had happened was, in 1912, you remember that there's been this complete fever about the cursed mummy. And I think the British Museum was sick of it. There were people trying to break in. There were people trying to have seances there. And so they decided to sell it to an American collector, and they just happened to put it on the Titanic, of course. So, and this was 1912. You know, the Titanic hit an iceberg. 1,517 people were killed due to insufficient lifeboats and confused and disorganized evacuation procedures. You may have seen the movie. I've never seen it, actually. Anyway, so why didn't she sink to the bottom of the North Atlantic, where she could be as magic as she wanted. Maybe she would even be pleased having a bit of peace. But the collector, according to this rumour, is supposed to have bribed the lifeboat organisers on the Titanic. What a scandal. Despite the cries of women and children first, he had himself and the mummy stowed on board of one of the lifecraft, and he spent the night in his lifeboat with the mummy and some passengers, floating around at night, and was rescued by a ship named the Carpathia, and then she went to New York with the collector. And of course it didn't end well for him, because he took it back to the States and he had it in his house, and all sorts of weird stuff happened in his house. I haven't got a lot of details of that, but he decided no, he couldn't have it, and he's going to send it back. And it must be that the British Museum had a returns policy, because I don't know what the period was, but he sent it back. And this time he did it via Canada, aboard a liner called the Empress of Ireland, and which set out from Quebec City. Guess what? This Empress with the mummy on board collided with a Norwegian coal ship in 29th May 1914. So it's 2 years-ish. She's had it for 2 years. So I think it will be out the returns policy. On the St. Lawrence River. And the Empress sank so quickly that there was only time to launch 7 of her 40 lifeboats. And 840 people died on the Empress of Ireland that had the mummy on board. Guess what? The mummy was rescued and was, apparently this is apparently true, and was put on board another ship you may have heard of, called the Lusitania, which was torpedoed by the Germans after in 1915, just off the coast of Ireland, and 1,200 people died off the Lusitania, and this caused the USA to join the First World War, didn't it? So Amun-Ra is supposed to have sunk with the Lusitania. There are problems with this, aren't there? Well, she's not at the bottom of the ocean. So David Castleton, to be fair to him, has done a lot of research on this, and it seems that he's looked into the cargo that sailed with the Titanic, and he says it's a fascinating list, including feathers, hatter's fur, auto parts, rabbit hair, elastics, and early refrigeration gadgets, but absolutely no mummies. So, and as he points out, as I had already worked out, the best evidence that the cursed mummy didn't go to the bottom of the ocean on the Titanic or the Empress of Ireland or the Lusitania is that there she is in the British Museum to this day. I actually went to visit her, and she didn't look, not for a while, but she doesn't actually look too bad. His article is well worth reading. David Castleton, Serpent's Pen. He's a great blog, actually. It's really, really great. And you can sign up, etc., etc. And, you know, he refers to the ghost haunting the British Museum London Underground station or tube station. And apparently this ghost used to walk up and down the platform, shrieking, and late at night, obviously, wearing only a loincloth but a magnificent headdress. And she terrified passengers and staff with horrendous, unearthly shrieks. Shrieks, as he says, said to have been resulted from the trauma being ripped from her tomb and brought many miles to a strange land. Well, a bit later, they opened another station, Holborn Station, which is less than 100 metres away, or yards in old talk. And in 1906, eventually, the British Museum became less and less frequented. This was obviously the ghost putting people off. And to the extent, the reputation was such to an extent that in 1933, just before it shut finally, 2 British newspapers offered a cash reward to anyone brave enough to spend a night alone there. Nobody took up the challenge. Would you have done it? I probably would have. But then, of course, what if it's true? What if you do die the next day? I've got things to do. So anyway, and funnily enough, the story of the haunting of British Museum Station sparked a film called Bulldog Jack. And in this movie, a secret tunnel leads from the London Underground station to the British Museum, there's lots of rumours about that being true. And actually, although you think, oh, it's just a conspiracy theory, why not? Because the British Museum has lots of kind of priceless artefacts in. And when London was being bombed during the Second World War, and even potentially during the First World War with the Zeppelins, they might have worried, and they had to have an exit. I watched an interesting program about the Knights Templars citadel in Israel, as it is now, and they had a secret underground temple to get there. Not underground temple. They had a secret underground passage to get their artifacts out. So why wouldn't the British government have built one to the tube station? So I don't think that's too far-fetched. But Bulldog Jack is all about this tunnel that goes to the underground station. And guess what? On the night that Bulldog Jack were released, 2 women are said to have disappeared while walking through the tunnels of Holborn Station. Screams and moans were heard around the time they vanished, and scratch marks appeared on the wall. During the following days, there were sightings of the head-dress-wearing priestess. And even today, some assert, if you stand on the platform at Holborn, you can occasionally hear shrieks and wails echoing down the tracks from British Museum Station. So there's the train track, which would have stopped at British Museum in about 100 yards. Of course, British Museum is closed, public can't get there, but this is where these screams come from. But of course, I've been at Holborn Station, I've heard screams and wails, but it was nothing to do with mummies, it was mainly to do with drunks. But there we are. And with that, I will finish the Curse of the Mummy story. It's a good one, wasn't it? The Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe. For the most wild, yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Yet mad I am not, and very surely do I not dream. But tomorrow I die, and today I would unburden my soul. My immediate purpose is to place before the world, plainly, succinctly, and without comment, a series of mere household events. In their consequences, these events have terrified, have tortured, have destroyed me. Yet I will not attempt to expound them. To me, they have presented little but horror. To many, they will seem less terrible than barocks. Hereafter, perhaps, some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. From my infancy, I was noted for the docility and humanity of my disposition. My tenderness of heart was even so conspicuous as to make me the jest of my companions. I was especially fond of animals, and was indulged by my parents with a great variety of pets. With these, I spent most of my time, and never was so happy as when feeding and caressing them. This peculiarity of character grew with my growth, and in my manhood I derived from it one of my principal sources of pleasure. To those who have cherished an affection for a faithful and sagacious dog, I need hardly be at the trouble of explaining the nature or the intensity of the gratification thus derivable. There is something in the unselfish and self-sacrificing love of a brute which goes directly to the heart of him who has had frequent occasion to test the paltry friendship and gossamer fidelity of mere man. I married early, and was happy to find in my wife a disposition not uncongenial with my own. Observing my partiality for domestic pets, she lost no opportunity of procuring those of the most agreeable kind. We had birds, goldfish, a fine dog, rabbits, a small monkey, and a cat. This latter was a remarkably large and beautiful animal, entirely black and sagacious to an astonishing degree. In speaking of his intelligence, my wife, who at heart was not a little tinctured with superstition, made frequent allusion to the ancient popular notion which regarded all black cats as witches in disguise. Not that she was ever serious upon this point, and I mention the matter at all for no better reason than it happens, just now, to be remembered. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favourite pet and playmate. I alone fed him, and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. Our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me. For what disease is like alcohol? And at length, even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. One night, returning home much intoxicated from one of my haunts about town, I fancied that the cat avoided my presence. I seized him, when in his fright at my violence he inflicted a slight wound upon my hand with his teeth. The fury of a demon instantly possessed me. I knew myself no longer. My original soul seemed at once to take its flight from my body, and a more than fiendish malevolence, gin-nurtured, thrilled every fibre of my frame. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat, and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I burn, I shudder when I pen the damnable atrocity. When reason returned with the morning, when I had slept off the fumes of the night's debauch, I experienced a sentiment half of horror, half of remorse for the crime of which I had been guilty. But it was at best a feeble and equivocal feeling, and the soul remained untouched. I again plunged into excess, and soon drowned in wine all memory of the deed. In the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of the lost eye presented, it is true, a frightful appearance, but he no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but, as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by this evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. But this feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. Yet I am not more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a silly action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. One morning, in cool blood, I slipped a noose about its neck and hung it to the limb of a tree. Hung it with the tears streaming from my eyes and with the bitterest remorse at my heart. Hung it because I knew that it had loved me, and because I felt it had given me no reason of offence. Hung it because I knew that in so doing I was committing a sin, a deadly sin, that would so jeopardize my immortal soul as to place it, if such a thing were possible, even beyond the reach of the infinite mercy of the most merciful and the most terrible God. On the night of the day on which this cruel deed was done, I was aroused from sleep by the cry of fire. The curtains of my bed were in flames, the whole house was blazing. It was with great difficulty that my wife, a servant, and myself made our escape from the conflagration. The destruction was complete. My entire worldly wealth was swallowed up, and I resigned myself thenceforward to despair. I am above the weakness of seeking to establish a sequence of cause and effect between the disaster and the atrocity, but I am detailing a chain of facts and wish not to leave even a possible link imperfect. On the day succeeding the fire, I visited the ruins. The walls, with one exception, had fallen in. This exception was found in a compartment wall, not very thick, which stood about the middle of the house, and against which had rested the head of my bed. The plastering had here in great measure resisted the action of the fire, a fact which I attributed to its having been recently spread. About this wall, a dense crowd were collected, and many persons seemed to be examining a particular portion of it with every minute and eager attention. The words "strange," "singular," and other similar expressions excited my curiosity. I approached and saw, as if graven in bas-relief upon the white surface, the figure of a gigantic cat. The impression was given with an accuracy truly marvelous. There was a rope around the animal's neck. When I first beheld this apparition fall, I could scarcely regard it as less. My wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in the garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with the view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half-sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species and of somewhat similar appearance with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat, half stupefied in the den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every aspect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white covering nearly the whole region of the breast. Upon my touching him, he immediately rose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once and became immediately a great favourite with my wife. For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed me. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not for some weeks strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added no doubt to my hatred of the beast was a discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared it to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed in a high degree that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed at my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring up upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I rose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or fastening its long and sharp claws on my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, by absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I'm almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I'm almost ashamed to own that the terror and the horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention, more than once, to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this above all I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Oh, mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me a man fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the former, the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter, I started hourly from dreams of unutterable fear to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, a feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased to hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent, and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me on some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe and forgetting in my wrath the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal which, of course, would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. Goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot, without a groan. The hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith, and with entire deliberation, to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I couldn't remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbors. Many projects entered my mind. At one period, I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box as if merchandise with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the hole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation, I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar, I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while, with little trouble, I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this, I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at least, then, my labor has not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had at length firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus, for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a free man. The monster in terror had fled the premises for ever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came very unexpectedly into the house and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee in my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say if but one word by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well-constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. "I may say an excellently well-constructed house. These walls— are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together." And here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily with a cane which I held in my hand upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blow sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry, at first muffled and broken like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. The Chimes at Midnight by Paula R.C. Redman. High above me, the hunter's moon cast its lengthy shadows as the first flurries of snow fell. The bitter wind tugged at my skirt as I crossed the wide expanse of lawn at the front of Crowhurst Hall. It was a journey I'd made many times before. In the past, I had failed in my effort to put right a wrong that has been done. As the snow swirled around me, seeming almost to sweep me up and over the threshold of my old home, it felt different this time.
In the cold hallway, I stood, dressed in what had once been my finery, before the old long-case clock. I studied its delicate, ornate hands. In the past, as a child, I'd found them fascinating too, but then they marked the passing of a happier time. Now, as I watched the seconds tick away and waited for its hourly chimes, but they did not come. Instead, they evoke some half-remembered remark in which I recalled that the past and the present, like the sweeping hands of a clock, run together. Yet to me it seemed like only yesterday when I heard it ring out its melancholy chimes to mark my passing. They resonated around my ice-cold body before the soil fell, clattering upon my coffin lid as the mourners left me beneath the frosty ground. Now the only sound I heard was the ticking of the clock. I wondered what had disturbed the tranquility of my eternal slumber. I knew I could remain only for so long within these walls, for I was no longer welcome. He who'd robbed me of everything I held so dear would be outraged to know I'd returned once more. My faded black taffeta skirt rustled on the flagstone floor as I moved aimlessly around. For a moment, I lingered in the library. Wisps of tenebrous memories came flooding back. Suddenly, I'm aware that I am not the only restless spirit in the house. I ascended the marble staircase. I paused and rested my hand lightly on its carved banister. The gentle, smiling faces of my beloved parents with vacant, painted eyes stared back at me. I reminisced their untimely passing. Something cold crept across the back of my bony neck and shoulders, making me shudder. I brushed my fingertips across my icy cheek, longing to feel unshed tears wash my face with warmth. I needed to cry for what had once been mine. I entered my old dressing room. The chilling night air filled it with dampness. Prior to my death, my servant Annie would have made sure a welcoming fire filled it with warmth and light, but now it was as welcoming as a cold, empty grave. In the past, I would have sat before the large ornate mirror with its exquisite carvings of cherubs, love hearts and doves. I would comb my glossy golden tresses while dreaming of my darling Henry's return from London. How my heart leapt with pleasure on hearing the sound of his carriage on the cobbles outside my window. Impatient for his embrace, my heart longed to hear his sweet, whispered words of love. Now, seated before the mirror, all I see is bone-dry, cadaverous skin stretching across my emaciated face as I brush dirt and worms from all that remains of my hair. Has time passed me by so quickly that I'm nothing but bones? At the sound of a door catch lifting, I dissolved into the shadows. A young woman glided into the room. Her beauty astounds me. With raven black hair, she was clothed only in a long white nightgown. She crossed a pool of moonlight, her feet blue with cold, and headed in my direction. In her dreamlike state, she seemed to be searching for something. Her movements were exaggerated, and she opened and closed drawers and cupboard doors. How could he betray me so? She muttered. I stepped out of the shadows. Hello, beautiful sleepwalker. What is it that disturbs your slumber? The sleepwalker's tear-stained eyes were unblinking. Yet something flickered across her forlorn face that made me realize that unlike me, death has no claim on her. I followed her, but she shows no signs that she's conscious of me. Please, do not be afraid. I mean you no harm. What disturbs you so? She turned. Her golden eyes dart back and forth as though she sought out a sound. I was pleased to know that she couldn't see me, but heard me. The sleepwalker lifted her hand to brush a strand of her raven hair from her lips. In the moonlight, I saw something shimmer. What's this you're wearing? I raised my bony, dust-dry hand before her face, so she saw what hung on my fleshless finger. With this ring, he did wed. So, he's wed another, making us 3. My heart's broken knowing I've failed another. Bewilderment settled on her face. Her pupils began to dilate. Then she saw me, as if in a dream. A voice carried neither weight nor sound. Like a child's sleeping breath, she asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Eleanor, back from whence I slept so peacefully, to warn you. Though I failed another I tried to save. Fate was so cruel." Her brow creased as she stared right through me. Then, suddenly aware that I'm not a ghost, her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a cry. With trembling lips, she uttered, "Incubus, succubus, begone!" In contempt, I shook my shrunken head, scattering dirt, worms, and hair around my bony feet. "I am neither. You may have youth and beauty on your side, but your days are numbered. As you see me standing before you, so you shall be one day. For there's no escaping from the hands of time. I wish only to see you grow old and not die before time's touch has lined your face." Suddenly, the tolling clock's mournful chimes echoed throughout the sleeping house with the passing of another hour. "At last," I cried, holding out my fleshless arms. "The ravages of time were undone. I stand clothed once more, flesh upon flesh, muscle and sinew. Time restores my golden tresses, but I cannot linger. Vanity is a weakness for the living, as time is not mine." She too wakes into half sleep and whispers, "You're Lady Eleanor. I've seen your portrait. And your tomb in the cemetery. 5 years have passed since you were murdered by an unknown intruder while your husband was away. What tale is this? Come, let me show you the truth, for too soon it will be your fate, if you are not careful." "What truth can you show me? You were murdered." With a shudder, she hurried to her bedroom. I followed her, afraid she would wake him. In my haste, I stepped into her bedroom, surprised to find how little has changed. All that we selected together for our love nest, he now shares with another. The noctambulist wiped the tears from her cheeks as she stared at her sleeping husband. "Fear not, he sleeps on." She glanced in my direction. Her lower lip trembled as she whispered, "When I see him sleeping so peacefully, my heart is full of love. The way the curls of his black hair fall lightly on his ruddy cheek. See how his lips part as he breathes gently. See the line of his jaw, so strong. How could you not fall for such a man?" I laughed. "Sweet night walker, if your heart is full with love for this sleeping man, then what makes you roam alone while he sleeps so serenely?" A questioning look flickered across her innocent face. "Should I not fear you, Lady Eleanor? For am I not, in my disturbed sleep, talking with a ghost?" I raised my empty hands to her. "I'm not here to do you harm. The living should not fear those of us who've passed over. We can do you no injury, sweet child. There's one who is living, whom you need to fear far more. How can I trust you? You have no right to be here." "Let me join you in your nocturnal amble, for this was once my childhood home. This much I know. So, what troubles you?" She gestured to the room. "There was once another who called this house a home. But unlike you, she's not a ghost. Come, let us go where we can talk more freely." As we left her sleeping husband, he rolled over, and I feel the darkness rearrange itself. I want so much for him to awake, so I can peer into his dark, soulless eyes once more. But alas, he sleeps on. In the hallway, apart from the steady ticking of the clock, the only other sound is that of the sleepwalker's bare feet on the stone floor. As a ghost, I create no lasting impression, not even sound. On entering the library, the young woman added another log to the dying embers in the grate. With a crackle, the fresh, dry wood ignited, throwing its warmth and light around the room. Although its heat didn't warm my dry bones, I still shuddered as the shadows of my past gathered in every corner, waiting for me to tell my tale of betrayal. Please, do you know about the other woman? I feared the worst, for I had visited her on such a night 3 years ago to warn her the best I could that death would be at her door. Unlike this woman, the second wife did not have a strong constitution. On that fateful night, before the clock struck the hour to restore me, I had stepped out of the shadows too soon. She had gazed upon my worm-eaten face, and her screams had woken her household. The sleepwalker stood before the French windows, staring at the moon through the lightly falling snow. With a heavy sigh, she turned. My husband had no right to marry me when he has a wife who lives in a mental asylum. I uncovered Lady Helen's journal in this very room a week ago. I read of her sadness. She haunts my thoughts and dreams. Unlike me, she was not strong and feared of destitution. Her worries slowly descended her into madness when Henry left her alone for days to travel to London. She feared he would not return. With no money to pay the servants' wages, they deserted her. Left alone, she roamed the icy corridors. Now you appeared to haunt my dreams. Oh, why do I doubt the man I love so true? Did you not believe her? I heard the hesitation in her voice. Once, like you, she believed every word he uttered. Now I am but a ghost. Now I am but a ghost belonging to the borderland. Like Lady Helen and you, he deceived me too. Not for love did he marry me, but my father's money. The day he drove the knife into my beating heart, he took pleasure in telling me so. Were you not killed by an unknown hand? No. The hand that took my life was none other than that of my husband Henry, and in this very room too. He drove the knife in while taking such delight in telling me how he'd taken my parents' lives too. He had their carriage driven off the road after discovering that my father had made inquiries in London's high society and discovered that Henry was scandalously in debt for gambling. With my dying breath, I cursed him. That's why I am not free to sleep for eternity until he has paid his debts in full to me. Oh, it's all true. He married me for my money too. While he has been away, I uncovered his secrets here. When I found Lady Helen's journal and the bloodied knife, I wanted so much to believe it was not true. She crossed to a shelf half hidden in the shadows, pulls out the valuable knife and lays it before me. 'Tis the one with which he took my life. Suddenly the door burst open and Henry came in. On seeing his wife seated alone, he boomed, "Oh, I do declare, my new wife betrays me, not with another, but I feel madness fills the air yet again. Am I so cruelly fated to find that another I took to be my bride suffering from lunacy too?" His wife turned to me and smiled. "Dear lady, take your leave," I said. "The time has come to set us free. Take Lady Helen's journal and keep it safe. Sleep deeply now until day breaks." Without a word, she picked up the book and took her leave. As Henry went to follow her, the door slammed shut. He watched in horror as the key spun in the lock and vanished. What trickery is this? Out of the shadows, I appeared, still beautiful in a dark and natural way, as I had been on the day he took my life. None that I can see, my lord, but revenge for those you've betrayed with your lies. Laughing, I lift the knife. An eye for an eye. His eyes wide with fear as the cold of the grave radiated from me. His face paled as he raised his trembling hands as if to protect himself. This cannot be. You're a ghost I should not see. Dear God, help me and send this devil back to the ground. The French windows burst open and the fire went out. Shadows surround him as I plunged the bejeweled knife into his cold, black heart. Henry dropped to his knees. As his confused spirit began to rise, he stared down at his dying self. What have you done to me? Time to pay for your sins. Now come, follow me. I turned towards the open doors. You cannot do this to me. I'm still breathing and can be saved. With a wave of my hand, he has no choice and reluctantly trails after me. We cross the lawn to the cemetery. In the freshly fallen snow, only his footprints will be seen by anyone when the new day breaks. In the distance, I heard the old hall clock ring out its melancholy chimes for the passing of the hour as the old day becomes the new. I sink into my grave, dragging what remained of Henry's conscious self down to lie at my side. Suddenly aware of his surroundings, Henry turned to face me just as the worms slither back into my eye sockets, nostrils, mouth, and hair, as time takes back what it had restored to me. His scream filled our narrow space. Oh, such joys at last to have you here beside me in this cold ground, dearest Henry. Did you think you could escape our wedding vows? Let no man put asunder, not even death could keep us apart. As I slip peacefully into eternal sleep with my husband at my side, the tombstone above our head now tells the truth. An unknown intruder murdered us who lie beneath this cold, cold ground. The Cold Embrace by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. He was an artist. Such things as happened to him happen sometimes to artists. He was a German. Such things as happened to him happen sometimes to Germans. He was young, handsome, studious, enthusiastic, metaphysical, reckless, unbelieving, heartless. And being young, handsome, and eloquent, he was beloved. He was an orphan, under the guardianship of his dead father's brother, his uncle Wilhelm, in whose house he had been brought up from a little child. And she who loved him was his cousin Gertrude, whom he swore he loved in return. Did he love her? Yes, when he first swore it. It soon wore out, this passionate love. How threadbare and wretched a sentiment it became at last in the selfish heart of the student. But in its golden dawn, when he was only 19, and had just returned from his apprenticeship to a great painter at Antwerp, and they wandered together in the most romantic outskirts of the city at rosy sunset, by holy moonlight, or bright and joyous morning. How beautiful a dream. They kept it a secret from Wilhelm, as he has the father's ambition of a wealthy suitor for his only child, a cold and dreary vision beside the lover's dream. So they are betrothed, and standing side by side when the dying sun and the pale rising moon divide the heavens, he puts the betrothal ring upon her finger, the white and taper finger, whose slender shape he knows so well. This ring is a peculiar one, a massive golden serpent, its tail in its mouth, the symbol of eternity. It had been his mother's, and he would know it amongst 1,000. If he were to become blind tomorrow, he could select it from amongst 1,000 by the touch alone. He places it on her finger, and they swear to be true to each other forever and ever, through trouble and danger, sorrow and change, in wealth or poverty. Her father must needs be one to consent to their union by and by, for they were now betrothed, and death alone could part them. But the young student, the scoffer at revelation, yet the enthusiastic adorer of the mystical, asks, "Can death part us? I would return to you from the grave, Gertrude. My soul would come back to be near my love, and you, if you died before me, the cold earth would not hold you from me. If you loved me, you would return, and again these fair arms would be clasped round my neck as they are now." But she told him, with a holier light in her deep blue eyes than had ever shone in his, she told him that the dead who die at peace with God are happy in heaven, and cannot return to the troubled earth, and that it is only the suicide, the lost wretch on whom sorrowful angels shut the door of paradise, whose unholy spirit haunts the footsteps of the living. The first year of their betrothal is past, and she is alone, for he has gone to Italy on a commission for some rich man to copy Raphael's, Titian's, Guido's in a gallery at Florence. He has gone to win fame, perhaps, but it is not the less bitter. He is gone. Of course, her father misses his young nephew, who has been as a son to him, and he thinks his daughter's sadness no more than a cousin should feel for a cousin's absence. In the meantime, the weeks and months pass. The lover writes, often at first, then seldom, at last, not at all. How many excuses she invents for him, how many times she goes to the distant little post office to which he is to address his letters, how many times she hopes only to be disappointed, how many times she despairs only to hope again. But real despair comes at last and will not be put off any more. The rich suitor appears on the scene, and the father is determined. She is to marry at once. The wedding day is fixed, the 15th of June. The date seems to burn into her brain. Date, written in fire, dances forever before her eyes. The date, shrieked by the Furies, sounds continually in her ears. But there is time yet. It is the middle of May. There is time. for a letter to reach him at Florence. There is time for him to come to Brunswick, to take her away and marry her in spite of her father, in spite of the whole world. But the days and the weeks fly by, and he does not write. He does not come. This is indeed despair which usurps her heart and will not be put away. It is the 14th of June. For the last time she goes to the little post office. For the last time she asks the old question, and they give her for the last time the dreary answer. No, no letter. For the last time. For tomorrow is the day appointed for the bridal. Her father will bear no entreaties. Her rich suitor will not listen to her prayers. They will not be put off a day, an hour. Tonight alone is hers, this night, which she may employ as she will. She takes another path than that which leads home. She hurries through some by-streets of the city, out onto a lonely bridge, where he and she had stood so often in the sunset, watching the rose-coloured light glow, fade, and die upon the river. He returns from Florence. He had received her letter, that letter blotted with tears, entreating, despairing. He had received it, but he loved her no longer. A young Florentine who had sat to him for a model had bewitched his fancy, that fancy which with him stood in place of a heart, and Gertrude had been half forgotten. If she had a rich suitor, good, let her marry him. Better for her, better far for himself. He had no wish to fetter himself with a wife. Had he not his art always, his eternal bride, his unchanging mistress? Thus, he thought it wiser to delay his journey to Brunswick so that he should arrive, when the wedding was over, arrive in time to salute the bride. And the vows, the mystical fancies, the belief in his return even after death to the embrace of his beloved, gone out of his life, melted away forever, those foolish dreams of his boyhood. So, on the 15th of June, he enters Brunswick by that very bridge on which she stood, the stars looking down on her the night before. He strolls across the bridge and down by the water's edge, a great rough dog at his heels, and the smoke from his short meerschaum pipe curling in blue wreaths fantastically in the pure morning air. He has his sketchbook under his arm, and attracted now and then by some objects that catch his artist's eye, stops to draw. A few weeds and pebbles on the river's bank, a crag on the opposite shore, a group of pollard willows in the distance. When he has done, he admires his drawing, shuts his sketchbook, empties the ashes from his pipe, refills from his tobacco pouch, sings the refrain of a gay drinking song, calls to his dog, smokes again, and walks on. Suddenly he opens his sketchbook again. This time, that which attracts him is a group of figures. But what is it? It's not a funeral. There are no mourners. It's not a funeral, but a corpse lying on a rude bier, covered with an old sail, carried between two bearers. It is not a funeral, but the bearers are fishermen in their everyday garb. About 100 yards from him, they rest their burden on a bank. One stands at the head of the bier, the other throws himself down at the foot of it, and thus they form the perfect group. He walks back 2 or 3 paces, selects his point of sight, and begins to sketch a hurried outline. He has finished it before they move. He hears their voices, though he cannot hear the words, and wonders what they can be talking of. Presently he walks on and joins them. "You have a corpse there, my friends," he says. "Yes, a corpse washed ashore an hour ago." "Drowned?" "Yes, drowned. Young girl, very handsome." "Suicides are always handsome," says the painter. And then he stands for a little while, idly smoking and meditating, looking at the sharp outline of the corpse and the stiff folds of the rough canvas covering. Life is such a golden holiday for him, young, ambitious, clever, that it seems as though sorrow and death could have no part in his destiny. At last he says that, as this poor suicide is so handsome, he should like to make a sketch of her. He gives the fishermen some money, and they offer to remove the sailcloth that covers her features. No, he'll do it himself. He lifts the rough, coarse, wet canvas from her face. What face? The face that shone on the dreams of his foolish boyhood. The face which once was the light of his uncle's home, his cousin Gertrude, his betrothed. He sees as in one glance while he draws one breath the rigid features, the marble arms, the hands crossed on the cold bosom, and on the third finger of the left hand, the ring which had been his mother's, the golden serpent. The ring which, if he were to become blind, he could select from 1,000 others by touch alone. But he is a genius and a metaphysician. Grief, true grief, is not for such as he. His first thought is flight. Flight anywhere out of that accursed city, anywhere far from the brink of that hideous river, anywhere away from remorse, anywhere to forget. He's miles on the road that leads from Brunswick before he knows that he has walked a step. It's only when his dog lies down panting at his feet that he feels how exhausted he is himself and sits down upon a bank to rest. How the landscape spins round and round before his dazzled eyes, while his morning sketch of the two fishermen and the canvas-covered beer glares redly at him out of the twilight. At last, after sitting a long time by the roadside, idly playing with his dog, idly smoking, idly lounging, looking as any idle, light-hearted travelling student might look, yet all the while acting over that morning scene in his burning brain 100 times a minute. At last, he grows a little more composed, and tries presently to think of himself as he is, apart from his cousin's suicide. Apart from that, he was no worse off than he was yesterday. His genius was not gone. The money he had earned in Florence still lined his pocketbook. He was his own master, free to go whither he would. And while he sits on the roadside, trying to separate himself from the scene of that morning, trying to put away the image of the corpse covered with the damp canvas sail, trying to think of what he should do next, where he should go to be farthest away from Brunswick and remorse, the old diligence coming rumbling and jingling along. He remembers it. It goes from Brunswick to Aix-la-Chapelle. He whistles to the dog, shouts to the postilion to stop, and springs into the coupe. During the whole evening, through the long night, though he does not once close his eyes, he never speaks a word. But when morning dawns and the other passengers awake and begin to talk to each other, he joins in the conversation. He tells them that he is an artist, that he is going to Cologne and to Antwerp to copy Rubens's and the great picture by Quentin Matsys in the museum. He remembered afterwards that he talked and laughed boisterously, and that when he was talking and laughing loudest, a passenger, older and graver than the rest, opened the window near him and told him to put his head out. He remembered the fresh air blowing in his face, the singing of the birds in his ears, and the flat fields and roadside reeling before his eyes. He remembered this, and then, falling in a lifeless heap on the floor of the diligence. It is a fever that keeps him for 6 long weeks on a bed at a hotel in Aix-la-Chapelle. He gets well, and, accompanied by his dog, starts on foot for Cologne. By this time, he is his former self once more. Again, the blue smoke from his short meerschaum curls upwards in the morning air. Again, he sings some old university drinking song. Again, stops here and there, meditating and sketching. He is happy. He has forgotten his cousin, and so on to Cologne. It is by the great cathedral he's standing, with his dog at his side. It is night. The bells have just chimed the hour, and the clocks are striking 11. The moonlight shines full upon the magnificent pile over which the artist's eye wanders, absorbed in the beauty of form. He is not thinking of his drowned cousin, for he has forgotten her, and is happy. Suddenly, someone, something, from behind him, puts 2 cold arms around his neck and clasps its hands on his breast. And yet there is no one behind him, for on the flags bathed in the broad moonlight, there are only 2 shadows, his own and his dog's. He turns quickly round. There is no one. Nothing to be seen in the broad square but himself and his dog, and though he feels He cannot see the cold arms clasped round his neck. It is not ghostly, this embrace, for it is palpable to the touch. It cannot be real, for it is invisible. He tries to throw off the cold caress. He clasps the hands in his own to tear them asunder and to cast them off his neck. He can feel the long, delicate fingers cold and wet beneath his touch. And on the third finger of the left hand, he can feel the ring which was his mother's, the golden serpent, the ring which he has always said he would know amongst 1,000 by the touch alone. He knows it now. His dead cousin's cold arms are around his neck. His dead cousin's wet hands are clasped upon his breast. He asks himself if he is mad. "Up, Leo," he shouts. "Up, up, boy." And the Newfoundland leaps to his shoulders. The dog's paws are on the dead hands, and the animal utters a terrific howl and springs away from his master. The student stands in the moonlight, the dead arms around his neck, and the dog at a little distance moaning piteously. Presently a watchman, alarmed by the howling of the dog, comes into the square to see what is wrong. In a breath, the cold arms are gone. He takes the watchman home to the hotel with him and gives him money. In his gratitude, he could have given the man half his little fortune. Will it ever come to him again, this embrace of the dead? He tries never to be alone. He makes 100 acquaintances and shares the chamber of another student. He starts up, if he is left by himself in the public room of the inn where he is staying, and runs into the street. People notice his strange actions and begin to think he's mad. But in spite of all, he is alone once more. For one night, the public room being empty for a moment, when on some idle pretense he strolls into the street is empty too. And for the second time, he feels the cold arms round his neck. And for the second time, when he calls his dog, the animal shrinks away from him with a piteous howl. After this, he leaves Cologne, still travelling on foot, of necessity now, for his money is getting low. He joins travelling hawkers. He walks side by side with labourers. He talks to every foot passenger he falls in with and tries from morning till night to get company on the road. At night, he sleeps by the fire in the kitchen of the inn at which he stops, but do what he will, he is often alone. And it is now a common thing for him to feel the cold arms round his neck. Many months have passed since his cousin's death. Autumn, winter, early spring. His money is nearly gone. His health is utterly broken. He is the shadow of his former self, and he is getting near to Paris. He will reach that city at the time of the carnival. To this he looks forward. In Paris, at carnival time, he need never surely be alone, never feel that deadly caress. He may even recover his lost gaiety, his lost health, once more resume his profession, once more earn fame and money by his art. How hard he tries to get over the distance that divides him from Paris, while day by day he grows weaker and he steps slower and more heavy. But there is an end at last. The long, dreary roads are past. This is Paris, which he enters for the first time. Paris, of which he has dreamed so much. Paris, whose million voices are to exercise his phantom. To him, tonight, Paris seems one vast chaos of lights, music, and confusion. Lights which dance before his eyes and will not be still. Music that rings in his ears and deafens him. Confusion which makes his head whirl round and round. But in spite of all, he finds the opera house, where there is a masked ball. He has enough money left to buy a ticket of admission and to hire a domino to throw over his shabby dress. It seems only a moment after his entering the gates of Paris that he is in the very midst of all the wild gaiety of the opera house ball. No more darkness, no more loneliness, but a mad crowd shouting and dancing, and a lovely débadeuse hanging on his arm. The boisterous gaiety he feels surely is his old light-heartedness come back. He hears the people round him talking of the outrageous conduct of some drunken student, And it is to him they point when they say this. To him who has not moistened his lips since yesterday at noon. For even now he will not drink, though his lips are parched and his throat burning. He cannot drink. His voice is thick and hoarse and his utterance indistinct. But still, this must be his old lightheartedness come back that makes him so wildly gay. The little débadeuse is wearied out. Her arm rests on his shoulder, heavier than lead. The other dancers, one by one, drop off. The lights in the chandeliers, one by one, die out. The decorations look pale and shadowy in that dim light, which is neither night nor day. A faint glimmer from the dying lamps, a pale streak of cold grey light from the newborn day, creeping in through half-opened shutters. And by this light, the bright-eyed débadeuse fades sadly. He looks her in the face. How the brightness of her eyes dies out. Again, he looks her in the face. How white that face has grown. Again, and now it is the shadow of her face alone that looks into his. Again, and they are gone, the bright eyes, the face, the shadow of the face. He is alone, alone in a vast saloon. Alone, and in the terrible silence, he hears the echoes of his own footsteps in that dismal dance, which has no music. No music, but the beating of his breast. The cold arms around his neck. They whirl him round, they will not be flung off or cast away. He can no more escape from their icy grasp than he can escape from death. He looks behind him. There is nothing but himself in that great empty salle. But he can feel cold, death-like. But oh, how palpable. The long, slender fingers, and the ring, which was his mother's. He tries to shout, but he has no power in his burning throat. The silence of the place is only broken by the echoes of his own footsteps in the dance from which he cannot extricate himself. Who says he has no partner? The cold hands are clasped on his breast, and now he does not shun their caress. No, one more polka if he drops down dead. The lights are all out, and half an hour after, the gendarmes come in with a lantern to see that the house is empty. They are followed by a great dog that they have found seated howling on the steps of the theatre. Near the principal entrance, they stumble over the body of a student who has died from want of food, exhaustion, and the breaking of a blood vessel.
The Monkey's Paw by W. W. Jacobs. 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady, knitting placidly by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check. I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways a bog, and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard. "There he is," said Herbert White as the gate banged to loudly, and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said tut-tut and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the 3rd glass his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk, the little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it," said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. "When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him." "He don't look to have taken much harm," said Mrs. White politely. "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, "just to look around a bit, you know." "Better where you are," said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers," said the old man. "What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?" "Nothing," said the soldier hastily. "Leastways, nothing worth hearing." "Monkey's paw?" said Mrs. White curiously. "Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps," said the sergeant major offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips, and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. "To look at," said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket, "it's just an ordinary little paw, tied to a mummy." He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. "It had a spell put on it by an old fakir," said the sergeant major, "a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it." His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. "Well, why don't you have 3, sir?" said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. "I have," he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. "And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?" asked Mrs. White. "I did," said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. "And has anybody else wished?" persisted the old lady. "The first man had his 3 wishes, yes," was the reply. I don't know what the first two were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw." His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group. "If you had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris," said the old man at last. "What'd you keep it for?" The soldier shook his head. "Fancy, I suppose," he said slowly. "I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It's caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward." "If you could have another 3 wishes," said the old man, eyeing him keenly, "would you have them?" "I don't know," said the other. "I don't know." He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. "Better let it burn," said the soldier solemnly. "If you don't want it, Morris," said the other, "give it to me." "I won't," said his friend doggedly. "I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man." The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. "How do you do it?" he inquired. "Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud," said the sergeant major, "but I warn you of the consequences." "Sounds like the Arabian Nights," said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. "Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?" The husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. "If you must wish," he said gruffly, "wish for something sensible." Mr. White dropped it back into his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second instalment of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he's been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give him anything for it, father?" inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. "A trifle," said he, colouring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Likely," said Herbert with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked." He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want." "If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it." His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman, as his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. "I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran towards him. "It moved," he cried with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." "It must have been your fancy, father," said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. "Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. A silence unusual and depressing settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert, as he bade them good night, "and something horrible squatting on top of the wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains." He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched up on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. "I suppose all old soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt your father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said the frivolous Herbert. "Morris said the things happened so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post brought a tailor's bill. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "Dare say," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer. "But for all that, the thing moved in my hand, that I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady soothingly. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed, and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden resolution flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Morn Meggins." The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband interposed. There, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down, and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir," and he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he's not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that, thank—" She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's perverted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length, in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery?" repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it, as he had been wont to do in their old courting days, nearly 40 years before. He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard," the other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss," he said without looking round. "I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant may have carried into his first action. "I was to say that Morn Meggins disclaim all responsibility," continued the other. "They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words. "How much?" £200 was the answer, and conscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. 3. In the huge new cemetery some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation, as though of something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that, the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You'll be cold." "It's colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He started up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room towards him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it?" "It's in the parlour on the bracket," he replied, marvelling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was that not enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you're mad," he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. "He's been dead 10 days. And besides, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I've nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlour, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she cried in a strong voice. "It's foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling, into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert," she screamed. "It's Herbert." She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy, it's Herbert," she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go, I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock, and another. The old woman with a sudden wrench broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back, and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice strained and panting. "The bolt," she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and the long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road.
Hound by H.P. Lovecraft. In my tortured ears, there sounds unceasingly a nightmare whirring and flapping, and a faint, distant baying of some gigantic hound. It is not dream, it is not, I fear, even madness, or too much has already happened to give me these merciful doubts. St. John is a mangled corpse, I alone know why, and such is my knowledge that I am about to blow out my brains for fear I shall be mangled in the same way. Down unlit and illimitable corridors of eldritch fantasy sweeps the black, shapeless nemesis that drives me to self-annihilation. May heaven forgive the folly and morbidity which led us both to so monstrous a fate. Wearied with the commonplace of a prosaic world where even the joys of romance and adventure soon grow stale, St. John and I had followed enthusiastically every aesthetic and intellectual movement which promised respite from our devastating ennui. The enigmas of the symbolists and the ecstasies of the pre-Raphaelites all were ours in their time, but each new mood was drained too soon of its diverting novelty and appeal. Only the somber philosophy of the decadence could hold us, and this we found potent only by increasing gradually the depth and diabolism of our penetrations. Baudelaire and Huysmans were soon exhausted of thrills, until finally there remained for us only the more direct stimuli of unnatural personal experiences and adventures. It was this frightful emotional need which led us eventually to that detestable course which even in my present fear I mention with shame and timidity, that hideous extremity of human outrage, the abhorred practice of grave robbing. I cannot reveal the details of our shocking expeditions or catalogue even partly the worst of the trophies adorning the nameless museum we prepared in the great stone house where we jointly dwelt, alone and servantless. Our museum was a blasphemous, unthinkable place, where with the satanic taste of neurotic virtuosi we'd assembled a universe of terror and decay to excite our jaded sensibilities. It was a secret room, far, far underground, where huge winged demons carved from the basalt and onyx vomited from wide grinning mouths, weird green and orange light, and hidden pneumatic pipes ruffled into kaleidoscopic dances of death, the lines of red charnel things, hand in hand, woven in voluminous black hangings. Through these pipes came at will the odours our moods most craved, sometimes the scent of pale funereal lilies, sometimes the narcotic incense of imagined eastern shrines of the kingly dead, and sometimes, how I shudder to recall it, the frightful, soul-upheaving stenches of the uncovered grave. Around the walls of this repellent chamber were cases of antique mummies alternating with comely, lifelike bodies perfectly stuffed and cured by the taxidermist's art, and with headstones snatched from the oldest churchyards of the world. Niches here and there contained skulls of all shapes and heads preserved in various stages of dissolution. There one might find the rotting bald pates of famous noblemen, and the fresh and radiantly golden heads of new-buried children. Statues and paintings there were, all of fiendish subjects, and some executed by St. John and myself. A locked portfolio bound in tanned human skin held certain unknown and unnameable drawings, which it was rumoured Goya had perpetrated but dared not acknowledge. There were nauseous musical instruments, stringed brass and woodwind, on which St. John and I sometimes produced dissonances of exquisite morbidity and cacodiamonical ghastliness, whilst in a multitude of inlaid ebony cabinets reposed the most incredible and unimaginable variety of tomb loot ever assembled by human madness and perversity. It is of this loot in particular that I must not speak, thank God. I had the courage to destroy it long before I thought of destroying myself. The predatory excursions on which we collected our unmentionable treasures were always artistically memorable events. We were no vulgar ghouls, but worked only under certain conditions of mood, landscape, environment, weather, season, and moonlight. These pastimes were to us the most exquisite form of aesthetic expression, and we gave their details a fastidious technical care. An inappropriate hour a jarring lighting effect or a clumsy manipulation of the damp sod would almost totally destroy for us that ecstatic titillation which followed the exhumation of some ominous grinning secret of the earth. Our quest for novel scenes and piquant conditions was feverish and insatiate, and it was he who led the way at last to that mocking, that accursed spot which brought us our hideous and inevitable doom. By what malign fatality were we lured to that terrible Holland churchyard? I think it was the dark rumour and legendary, the tales of one buried for 5 centuries who had himself been a ghoul in his time and had stolen a potent thing from a mighty sepulchre. I can recall the scene in those final moments, the pale autumnal moon over the graves casting long, horrible shadows, the grotesque trees drooping sullenly to meet the neglected grass and the crumbling slabs, the vast legions of strangely colossal bats that flew against the moon, the antique ivied church pointing a huge spectral finger at the livid sky, the phosphorescent insects that danced like death fires under the yews in a distant corner, the odours of mould, vegetation, and less explicable things that mingled feebly with the night wind from over far swamps and seas, and worst of all, the faint, deep-toned baying of some gigantic hound, which we could neither see nor definitely place. As we heard this suggestion of baying, we shuddered, remembering the tales of the peasantry, for he whom we sought had centuries before been found in this self-same spot, torn and mangled by the claws and teeth of some unspeakable beast. I remembered how we delved in this ghoul's grave with our spades, and how we thrilled at the picture of ourselves, the grave, the pale watching moon, the horrible shadows, the grotesque trees, the titanic bats, the antique church, the dancing death fires, the sickening odours, the gently moaning night wind, and the strange, half-heard, directionless baying, of whose objective existence we could scarcely be sure. Then we struck a substance harder than a damp mould, and beheld a rotting oblong box crusted with mineral deposits from the long undisturbed ground. It was incredibly tough and thick, but so old that we finally pried it open and feasted our eyes on what it held. Much, amazingly much, was left of the object despite the lapse of 500 years. The skeleton, though crushed in places by the jaws of the thing that had killed it, held together with surprising firmness, and we gloated over the clean white skull and its long firm teeth and its eyeless sockets that once had glowed with a charnel fever like our own. In the coffin lay an amulet of curious and exotic design, which had apparently been worn around the sleeper's neck. It was the oddly conventionalized figure of a crouching, winged hound or sphinx, with a semi-canine face, and was exquisitely carved in antique oriental fashion from a small piece of green jade. The expression of its features was repellent in the extreme, savouring at once of death, bestiality, and malevolence. Around the base was an inscription in characters which neither I nor St. John could identify, and on the bottom, like a maker's seal, was graven a grotesque and formidable skull. Immediately upon beholding this amulet, we knew that we must possess it, that this treasure alone was our logical pelf from the centuried grave. Even had its outlines been unfamiliar, we would have desired it, but as we looked more closely, we saw that it was not wholly unfamiliar. Alien it indeed was to all art and literature which sane and balanced readers know, but we recognized it as the thing hinted of in the forbidden Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, the ghastly soul symbol of the corpse-eating cult of inaccessible Leng in Central Asia. All too well did we trace the sinister lineaments described by the old Arab demonologist. Lineaments, he wrote, drawn from some obscure supernatural manifestation of the souls of those who vexed and gnawed at the dead. Seizing the green jade object, we gave a last glance at the bleached and cavern-eyed face of its owner, and closed up the grave as we found it. As we hastened from that abhorrent spot, the stolen amulet in St. John's pocket, we thought we saw the bats descend in a body to the earth we had so lately rifled, as if seeking for some cursed and unholy nourishment. But the autumn moon shone weak and pale, and we couldn't be sure. So, too, as we sailed the next day away from Holland to our home, we thought we heard the faint, distant baying of some gigantic hound in the background. But the autumn wind moaned sad and wan, and we could not be sure. Less than a week after our return to England, strange things began to happen. We lived as recluses, devoid of friends, alone and without servants, in the few rooms of an ancient manor house on a bleak and unfrequented moor, so that our doors were seldom disturbed by the knock of the visitor. Now, however, we were troubled by what seemed to be frequent fumblings in the night, not only around the doors, but around the windows also, upper as well as lower. Once we fancied that a large opaque body darkened the library window when the moon was shining against it, and another time we thought we heard a whirring or flapping sound not far off. On each occasion, investigation revealed nothing, and we began to ascribe the occurrences to imagination alone, that same curiously disturbed imagination which still prolonged in our ears the faint, far baying we thought we had heard in the Holland churchyard. The jade amulet now reposed in a niche in our museum, and sometimes we burned strangely scented candles before it. We read much in Alhazred's Necronomicon about its properties and about the relation of ghouls' souls to the objects it symbolized, and were disturbed by what we read. Then terror came. On the night of September the 24th, I heard a knock at my chamber door. Fancying it St. John's, I bade the knocker enter, but was answered only by a shrill laugh. There was no one in the corridor. When I aroused St. John from his sleep, he professed entire ignorance of the event and became as worried as I. It was that night that the faint, distant baying over the moor became to us a certain and dreaded reality. 4 days later, whilst we were both in the hidden museum, there came a low, cautious scratching at the single door which led to the secret library staircase. Our alarm was now divided, for besides our fear of the unknown, we had always entertained a dread that our grisly collection might be discovered. Extinguishing all lights, we proceeded to the door and threw it suddenly open, whereupon we felt an unaccountable rush of air and heard, as if receding far away, the queer combination of rustling, tittering, and articulate chatter. Whether we were mad, dreaming, or in our senses, we did not try to determine. We only realized, with the blackest of apprehensions, that the apparently disembodied chatter was beyond a doubt in the Dutch language. After that, we lived in growing horror and fascination. Mostly we held to the theory that we were jointly going mad from our life of unnatural excitements, but sometimes it pleased us more to dramatize ourselves as the victims of some creeping and appalling doom. Bizarre manifestations were now too frequent to count. Our lonely house was seemingly alive with the presence of some malign being whose nature we could not guess. And every night that demonic baying rolled over the windswept moor, always louder and louder. On October the 29th, we found in the soft earth underneath the library window a series of footprints utterly impossible to describe. They were as baffling as the hordes of great bats which haunted the old manor house in unprecedented and increasing numbers. The horror reached a culmination on November the 18th when St. John, walking home after dark from the distant railway station, was seized by some frightful carnivorous thing and torn to ribbons. His screams had reached the house, and I had hastened to the terrible scene in time to hear a whir of wings and see a vague black, cloudy thing silhouetted against the rising moon. My friend was dying when I spoke to him, and he could not answer coherently. All he could do was to whisper, "The amulet, that damned thing." Then he collapsed, an inert mass of mangled flesh. I buried him the next midnight in one of our neglected gardens and mumbled over his body one of the devilish rituals he had loved in life. And as I pronounced the last demoniac sentence, I heard afar on the moor the faint baying of some gigantic hound. The moon was up, but I dared not look at it. And when I saw on the dim-lit moor a wide nebulous shadow sweeping from mound to mound, I shut my eyes and threw myself face down upon the ground. When I arose trembling, I know not how much later, I staggered into the house and made shocking obeisances before the enshrined amulet of green jade. Being now afraid to live alone in the ancient house on the moor, I departed on the following day for London, taking with me the amulet, after destroying by fire and burial the rest of the impious collection in the museum. But after 3 nights I heard the baying again, and before a week was over felt strange eyes upon me whenever it was dark. One evening, as I strolled along on Victoria Embankment for some needed air, I saw a black shape obscure one of the reflections of the lamps in the water. A wind stronger than the night wind rushed by, and I knew what had befallen St. John must soon befall me. The next day I carefully unwrapped the green jade amulet and sailed for Holland. What mercy I might gain by returning the thing to its silent sleeping owner I knew not, but I felt that I must at least try any step conceivably logical. What the hound was and why it pursued me were questions still vague, but I had at first heard the baying in that ancient churchyard, and every subsequent event, including St. John's dying whisper, had served to connect the curse with the stealing of the amulet. Accordingly, I sank into the nethermost abysses of despair when, at an inn in Rotterdam, I had discovered that thieves had despoiled me of this sole means of salvation. The baying was loud that evening, and in the morning I read of a nameless deed in the vilest quarter of the city. The rabble were in terror, for upon an evil tenement had fallen a red death, beyond the foulest previous crime of the neighbourhood. In a squalid thieves' den, an entire family had been torn to shreds by an unknown thing, which left no trace. And those around had heard all night above the usual clamour of drunken voices, a faint, deep, insistent note, as of a gigantic hound. So at last I stood again in that unwholesome churchyard, where a pale winter moon cast hideous shadows, and leafless trees drooped sullenly to meet the withered frosty grass and cracking slabs, and the ivied church pointed a jeering finger at the unfriendly sky, and the night wind howled maniacally from over frozen swamps and frigid seas. The baying was very faint now, and it ceased altogether as I approached the ancient grave I had once violated, and frightened away an abnormally large horde of bats which had been hovering curiously around it. I know not why I went thither, unless to pray, or gibber out insane pleas and apologies to the calm white thing that lay within. But whatever my reason, I attacked the half-frozen sod with a desperation, partly mine, and partly that of a dominating will outside myself. Excavation was much easier than I expected, though at one point I encountered a queer interruption when a lean vulture darted down out of the cold sky and pecked frantically at the grave earth until I killed him with a blow of my spade. Finally, I reached the rotting oblong box and removed the damp nitrous cover. This is the last rational act I ever performed. For crouched within that century coffin, embraced by a close-packed nightmare retinue of huge, sinewy, sleeping bats, was the bony thing my friend and I had robbed, not clean and placid as we had seen it then, but covered with caked blood and shreds of alien flesh and hair, and leering sentiently at me with phosphorescent sockets and sharp and sanguine fangs, yawned twistedly in mockery of my inevitable doom. And when it gave from those grinning jaws a deep sardonic bay as of some gigantic hound, and I saw that it held in its gory, filthy claw the lost and fateful amulet of green jade, I merely screamed, and ran away idiotically, my screams soon dissolving into peals of hysterical laughter. Madness rides the star wind, claws and teeth sharpened on centuries of corpses, dripping death astride a bacchanal of bats from night-black ruins of buried temples of Belial. Now, as the baying of that dead, fleshless monstrosity grows louder and louder, and the stealthy whirring and flapping of those accursed web wings circles closer and closer, I shall seek with my revolver the oblivion which is my only refuge from the unnamed and unnameable.